Hey guys, and welcome back to part 2 of how to make this slingshot with a fixed blade knife coming out the bottom of the handle. So let's jump in straight where we left off last time with the knife completely finished and starting on the slingshot side. So this is what my slingshot looks like once I've got my knife finished, and now we're going to move on to making the slingshot part. So the first thing to do is, if you're following my blueprints exactly, then you want to trace on the side profile of the slingshot side onto some paper. If you don't want to use it exactly the same as I have, you can design your own palm swell shape and your own finger swell shape if you want. Firstly, I've traced the full side profile of the palm swell and the finger swell onto some 1mm thick brass. This is going to go either side of the knife and the aluminium, securing them both together. I've then, from the side profile of the brass, traced that onto some 4mm thick aluminium, which is the same thickness as my D2 knife making steel. I then stopped tracing it when it got to the point where the knife would join with the aluminium, so that once they're both cut out they can join seamlessly together like this. I then did the same with the finger swell as well. This is what it looks like once I've traced out all of the pieces, and as you can see, I've traced out the outline of the finger swell and the palm swell onto the 1mm thick brass twice because it's going to be sandwiching the aluminium and the knife steel. It's now time to yet again use my hacksaw and my files to shape out the aluminium. I need to be very precise when cutting this down so that it fits seamlessly with the knife steel. I also cut out the brass using some tin snips. Once all of the pieces have been cut out, they can be joined together like this. The brass sandwiches the aluminium either side and then also sandwiches the knife steel, holding them all together. I roughen up the surfaces with some 80 grit sandpaper and then glue the brass either side of the knife steel and the aluminium with some epoxy resin. Before I start shaping, I need to leave for the epoxy to set overnight so that I've got a very strong bond and the layers don't try and delaminate. Now I can start shaping the brass down to the shape of the aluminium and the knife steel. For this I'm using a Dremel tool since it doesn't pull them either side and try to delaminate them, but you could just use a metal file. Once on both sides the brass has been sanded down flush to the aluminium and knife steel, I can then move on to the next step. The next step is to laminate on material in between the gaps of the finger swell and the palm swell to make it more comfortable. I've decided that for the palm swell I want to use rocks because I haven't used them before and I just want to experiment with them. Rocks were an unnecessary step to use, and you could just use wood or plastic or anything else that you have lying about, but rocks do leave a very nice finish, and in the end they did turn out very nicely. This is just a variety of small pebbles and stones that I found on the beach. So now I'm going to prepare a couple of rocks to be glued onto the slingshot. First thing I have to do is draw on the largest possible sort of square shape onto it where it's going to laminate on. The rock needs to have flat 90-degree edges so that they can all be glued on properly. Now, using a large rock file, which I have, and you could also just use a metal file, I'm sanding the edges down until they're flush with the lines. It's extremely important that when you're doing this you wear a good dust mask to protect you from all of the bad dusts created by the rocks. Once shaped down to all of the edges to 90 degrees, I can use a 2-part epoxy resin again to glue on the rocks onto the slingshot handle. I clamp them up using a variety of elastic bands and G-clamps and more grip pliers. Since the rocks are slightly porous, they absorb the epoxy very slightly and then they make a very strong bond. I can then use the stone file which I was using earlier to shape it down to the basic shape of the slingshot handle. Again, it is incredibly important to wear a dust mask here since some rocks will create a toxic silicon dust that's really irritant to your lungs. These rocks are all quite soft and easy to shape, but if you picked some harder rocks off the beach it would be almost impossible to shape them. The disadvantage of having softer rocks is I've got to be really careful I don't chip parts off the edges where they join to the metal. Eventually I've been able to shape down the rocks to the side profile of the slingshot, and I've also been able to curve them slightly. Then glue on 3 more rocks on the other side, and they don't have to be symmetrical since none of the rocks are very the same. When I'm filing them down I do try to make the shape symmetrical though, so that it looks nice on either side. This is what the palm swell then looks like once it's finished with all of the rock laminations. As you can see, the joint between the rocks and the brass is really smooth, and there's no jagged lines or anything like that. Now for the other side, since I didn't have any rocks left, I'm going to glue on some rare Irish wych elm wood, which is from the burr of the tree, so that it's going to have a very nice grain. I also on the other side have glued on some homemade mccarter made of different coloured materials. As always, I'm shaping them down using rasps and files so that they're flush with the metal. Once curved, both sides of the materials look like this. Also further up the slingshot, I glued on some denim mccarter. Now on the slingshot forks, I've glued on some big pieces of hardwood, and I'm not sure what the name of the hardwood is though. However, this wood is quite strong, so it's going to reinforce the slingshot forks a lot. Using rasps and a wood saw, I shape it down to the basic shape of the outline of the slingshot forks. Then over the top of that, I glued on a substance called high pressure laminate, which is high pressure laminated together pieces of paper, and it creates an incredibly strong black plastic sort of material called phlonomic sheeting. This is incredibly tough material to shape with the rasps, but it's too soft and clogs up the files, so it's kind of annoying to shape, but then the end result is really worth it. Once it's shaped down, you can see that the slingshot forks are really incredibly reinforced by the two different materials. Now I'm tapering off the high pressure laminate material so that it gets thinner towards the ends, and this is going to make it look better and also so that it's smoother. Yet again, this takes a really long time with the rasps since it's quite tough material. Once I've got one side shaped, I'm going to move on to the other side and make it exactly symmetrical. Once shaped down, the material looks quite rough and unpleasing, but it actually turns out really nicely once polished. Now to reinforce the forks even more, I've glued on some more of the hardwood. Each piece is only 9mm thick, but it's very strong. As always, I'm just using rasps, files and a wood saw to shape down the wood to the basic outline of the fork area. I then also start to contour and shape it so that there's no gaps in between the different laminations, and I curve it so that it looks a lot nicer. I also round the top of the slingshot forks and put in grooves for the bands to attach onto. This is what the slingshot looks like once that's done. For this next step, I'm going to use some sanding drums or Dremels, and I got these off eBay for only £5. If you don't have sanding drums or things like that, then you could also just use some 80 grit sandpaper wrapped down different sizes of wooden dowels. The main reason that I prefer sanding drums is because there's a lot of different sizes and diameters that you can use, and then you can get the perfect curve on what you want. I'm using the sanding drums to curve and shape all of the sharp edges of the slingshot on the fork area, and I'm also using it to smooth out and get rid of any deep scratches in the aluminium left behind by rasps, files or the saw. Once that's done, there's no deep scratches left behind in the slingshot, and I'm just going to give it a quick coat of boiled linseed oil. The reason I do this before I've finished finally sanding up the slingshot is so that more of the oil can soak into the different parts of wood and rock. Once that's done, the slingshot looks quite nice, and you could just leave it like this, but I want to bring it up to an even more shiny finish. To do that, I'm going to be using some sanding sponges which I bought off eBay. They were very cheap, and for slingshots and handle projects they're a lot better than sandpaper, I think, since they take a lot more time to wear out and they leave a much nicer finish on curved edges. I'm just starting at 80 grit and then working my way all the way up to 600 grit, and you know that you should move on to the next grit when the sanding sponge is no longer removing any more scratches. Here's what the slingshot looks like once I've made it all the way up to 600 grit, and you can see that even the metal parts look really nice. Also, the laminations between different materials are completely smooth, and when you run your finger over them you couldn't feel the difference. I then gave the slingshot another coat of oil, and now the actual slingshot part is completely finished. It looks really nice, and it's really tempting to go and shoot it now, but that's really dangerous because I don't have a sheath on the knife at the moment. So the next step before the slingshot's finished is to make a very secure sheath so that I don't accidentally stab myself. So what I did was I traced on the shape of the blade onto the 4mm thick aluminium and then cut it out in a horseshoe shape that's going to sit around the blade to protect it. Conveniently, the aluminium is the same thickness as the knife steel, so it'll work very well. I then roughly traced around the edges of the aluminium onto the 1mm thick brass that I was using earlier. Again, I'm cutting out the brass using some tin snips, and it's quite quick. And then just using some quick dry super glue to glue on the brass onto the aluminium. Of course, I clamp it up in the vise for extra pressure. Once both sides have been glued on like this, you can easily slide the knife into the sheath and it's held in quite firmly. I'm now drawing on dots where I'm going to drill through with pins to hold the knife sheath together. Once that's done, I can use a center punch to hammer in little dents for me to drill through the holes more accurately. Then I go over to my drill press and start to drill through on the holes. Once they'd all been drilled through, I added pins and then sanded the pins down flush with the metal. I then glued on some black flanonomic sheeting, which is only 1mm thick, and that's just going to act as a sheeting over the brass. I'm now sanding it all down using Dremels and files. Once it's all been sanded flush, it looks like this, and I think that it looks really good at the moment. Friction holds the sheath on very, very securely, and even when I shake it my hardest, I can't get it to fall off. I'm now going to use Dremels and sanding sponges to sand all of the edges so that they're completely shiny. This will also help to slightly round the edges and make it look a bit nicer. Now that that's been done, the sheath is completely finished and the slingshot is ready to shoot. All that I need to do is attach some double layered tapered THERABAND gold, which is semi-butterfly shooting and fires 15mm steel ball bearings. If you have no clue what that means at all and you don't know how to make slingshot bands, I've got a tutorial on my channel on how to make them, and although it is quite an old tutorial, it still explains very well how to make them. Alternatively, if you don't have access to THERABAND gold or something like that, you can buy pre-made band sets off websites like simpleshot.com or Gamekeeper John. Now the slingshot's completely finished and it's ready to shoot. Of course, while shooting, always have the sheath over the knife so that when you shoot the slingshot you don't accidentally cut yourself or stab yourself. As well, always wear safety glasses. Firing some 15mm steel ball bearings at about 10 meters. So it appears that the slingshot shot really well and it was really accurate to shoot. Thanks for watching guys, I'm really glad that you've watched this far, and if you did enjoy this video, I put a lot of time and effort into it, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button down below and subscribe. If you have any other weapon related videos that you'd like me to make, then just post a comment down below or send me a personal message with your suggestions.